Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. We have a great guest, Governor Matt Bevin of Kentucky. How are you, sir?
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm doing well, thank you.
Thank you. You know, you're uniquely qualified to talk about this upcoming election, given your background. And I want to talk very briefly about your background, then we'll jump right in. First, the first office you've ever held is Governor of Kentucky.
That's correct.
First office the President has ever held is President of the United States.
He aimed a little higher, and I'm glad he did.
He aimed a little higher, but I want to get into this with you in just a moment. You were elected the 62nd Governor of Commonwealth of Kentucky in 2015. There haven't been many Republican governors of Kentucky, have there, in modern times?
No, I might be like the fourth or so in the last 100 years. We don't do this very often, that's true.
Now, you grew up with a family of 8. You lived in an old farmhouse. You were dirt poor, based on what I read.
We were financially
poor, but
humble.
Not dirt poor.
Financially humble. That's
right.
Certainly under the poverty level.
You grew up on a farm. You raised crops, livestock, and you had parents who instilled on you family and faith. You attended Washington Lee University in Virginia later in an ROTC scholarship. Upon graduation, active duty in the United States Army as an officer, you left the service having achieved the rank of captain. And you founded several companies in Kentucky. You invested in a number of others in the Commonwealth as well as in other states. And I want to talk about this election. I think it's very, very important. Then I want to circle back to your own experience and how you became governor. It wasn't so simple. It's not a straight line in a tough state. They keep talking about this blue wave. And some of the early indications are there is going to be, or maybe some kind of blue wave. You're a man of government, you're a man of history, you're a man of politics. What do you see happening here?
I am a student of history. I've always prided, I grew up in a home with no television, so we did read a lot, and I've always been intellectually curious about a variety of things. And I tend to look at statistics, and they seem to stick in my head. And I do know this, that in modern times, there have only been twice when there was not a midterm shift in power. And so it is the norm. It would be unusual if the Democrats did not take control of the House. In fact, the average has been 31 seats in each of the midterm elections that have changed parties. The Republicans have a 24-seat lead, I believe, which would imply that they would be 7 seats down. Statistically, historically, it's a given that they will lose the House. But there have been 2 times when that did not happen. I truly do believe this will be the 3rd time. The paradigm has shifted a bit. We're in a different time. And people, for all of the narrative that we get in what passes for mainstream media, and I say that not pejoratively, but just that's what they would call themselves, traditional media, would have us believe that, A, this person who is now the president, Donald Trump, isn't even really the president, shouldn't have been, had no chance, doesn't deserve to be there, is 1 step away from being impeached. All the things, this narrative that they would have us believe is not really connected to what the American people believe, or he wouldn't have gotten 307 electoral votes. The whole point being that I think there is an appetite for what he's been doing that is not evident based on polling or what people are saying or what yard signs or bumper stickers are out there, just as it was not evident in 2016. I think this will be the 3rd time. Will the Republicans lose seats? Yes, they will. It would be shocking if they did not. In fact, they will lose seats. Will they lose 31? I don't believe so. Will they lose even 25? I don't believe so. We'll see. I mean, the voters will decide. Every district is different. But the level of resentment that is held by a handful is not widespread among the people. And I truly believe that people are grateful for this president, his willingness to shake things up, his willingness to deliver on promises that he made. He is doing, and people may or may not like the methodology, but you can't argue with the results. And he is somebody who is executing like very few people that have preceded him in terms of what he ran on. And that's a refreshing change of pace for Americans.
These news reports talk about how the Democrat base is all fired up and how the Republican base is relatively passive. I'm starting to see a change in this, that there's potential backlash, that the media are really so one-sided, so over the top, the Democrats, whether it's hearings or whatever is taking place, the attacks on Ted Cruz and other conservatives and Republicans who serve in the administration at restaurants and so forth, you really think there's this relatively silent majority, so-called, that's out there and that's going to show up in the midterm elections?
There's no way I would be the governor. There's no way that President Trump would be the president if that majority did not exist. It wouldn't be possible, because I didn't have the support of the party or of the powers that be or of any particular political establishment, nor did he. In fact, I was, at a more microcosmic level in Kentucky, a shock to the system in ways that unnerved people, because who was I? I was somebody who I hadn't kissed the right rings or backsides or waited in line or whatever the case might be. And he's done the same thing. But America is hungry for this. Americans are not the fools that the media and so many in the political ranks would have us believe that we are. That's the greatness of America, is that people are, at the end of the day, not easily fooled. And I truly believe that there is a hunger for a continuation of the path we're on, which is America standing firmly for life and liberty and the things that this show is here to discuss. These are the foundational tenets upon which this nation was built. It's refreshing when we actually have a leader in Washington who believes this to his core.
You mentioned the House of Representatives. How about the United States Senate? You know, when you look at the map, the United States Senate, the Republicans should be winning a whole bunch of seats.
Sure.
The Republicans in the Senate and the House, they haven't delivered on a lot of their promises. The president has. Spending's way up, the debt's way up, but they've done some good things. I mean, with judges and so forth, but not an additional penny for the wall that the president is trying very, very aggressively to get taken care of. How do you see the Senate in this election?
I would be shocked if they didn't pick up 1 or 2 seats. I mean, you're correct, in a different environment, with a different sense of motivation and a different sense of urgency, perhaps. And the reasons for why we're not getting those things, you could lay, directional blame in any number of directions. We might pick up 5, 6, 7. Truthfully, we have far more potential pickups than we have seats to defend as Republicans. I say this as a Republican. But I think we could pick up 1 or 2 pretty easily. I would be shocked if we didn't come out with 53 or 4 seats in the Senate. I really would.
So what you're saying is, on election night, on that first Tuesday night in November, we're all going to be watching television or listening to the radio, and the same people who were shocked at Donald Trump's victory are going to be shocked at what happens in the midterm elections.
I believe so. Because what happens is that it becomes this false narrative that for whatever reason has been predetermined in the minds of some. And they try to will it into fruition by talking about it nonstop as if it's a foregone conclusion, and it's interesting because within the insular worlds in which people have these conversations, it all sounds so good and nobody disagrees because they all want the same false narrative to come true. But out there in the heartland, in places like Kentucky, people aren't reading the Washington Post. They're not reading the New York Times. They don't really give a rip about what some prognosticator in Washington, D.C. thinks about the political landscape. They don't. What they care about are the same things that they have always cared about. They care about the security of their families, the physical security and the financial security. They care about their wallet. They care about whether the money that they earn is able to be kept as much as possible by themselves, and to the extent that it's not, what the government does with it is actually useful and productive. These are simple things. We're simple people. We're not easily fooled as Americans. We're not idiots, but at the same time, we also want simple things in our lives. We want our families to live in freedom, and we want as little government in our lives as possible. I wear this, button right here. It's a little pair of scissors cutting through red tape. It's an indication people on my team wear this. I pledged when I was elected I'm going to cut 30% of all the regulation in our state over 3 years, and we're well on our way to doing it. And people who say, hey, this is somehow going to compromise our safety, our security, our environment, what have you, nonsense. Still 100 and some thousand rules telling us what we can or can't do. Americans are fed up with this. Nobody wants a dirty environment or dirty air, dirty, unsafe streets or whatever the case might be. But they are increasingly less convinced that more government rules are the answer to give them the liberty that innately they were created to crave, and that we've been blessed in this nation like no people that have ever lived on this earth to have in such abundance that we can afford to take it for granted. It's my greatest fear. I was asked recently, what the biggest threat to America was. I think it's our apathy. It is the fact that we are so blessed that we can afford to not care. Think about that. We have so good that we can afford to not care, and we're convinced that our quality of life is not likely to change much. That's the beginning of the end. Every culture and civilization since the dawn of man has crumbled from within. Exterior wars, wars move nations' capitals. They move borders. But wars do not destroy cultures. Wars do not destroy civilizations. Those are destroyed from within due to complacency and due to apathy.
Beyond this presidency, beyond this election, do you think we're beginning to crumble from within?
No, there's no doubt. I wrote a letter back some years ago to someone in the faith-based community, and it was entitled, "Where Are the Daniels?" And this was before I had ever thrown my hat into the political arena. This was as somebody, as an observer, as a father, as a veteran, as a husband, as a tax-paying employer of other people. Somebody who was like so many of your viewers that is just out there living my life. I looked around at the landscape and I said, what are we doing? We've become numb. We have come, and again, it's not to pick on, I'm a big believer in term limits. I just am, always have been. Nothing good comes from complacency in any one place. Whether it's in a business, whether it's in government, whether it's in a church, pick the category. If people become too accustomed to any one thing for too long, it usually doesn't result in a better environment. And so to that end, I looked around and I said, America is getting soft. The underbelly is getting soft. And I did worry about this. So I wrote this letter. I said, where are the Daniels? Where are the people from among us, normal people, that are willing to rise up and give some modern day equivalent of defiance to the king and say, this is not acceptable. This is not who we are. These are not the values that we hold. And so this has been something of concern to me for some time. I will say this, you often hear people in politics talk about how we're at some kind of a crossroads. I would beg to differ only in this respect. I think in recent years, and we saw it in 2016 and we're still there, it's more of a fork in the road. A crossroad implies a lot of options. A fork in the road, you're going one way or the other. And America is still, but has very much in recent years been at this fork in the road. And we were going to dogleg hard to the left in a way that may or may not have ever been possible to return from or go to the right.
When we come back, I want to ask you, what should all these Republicans be running on? You're a conservative. You ran as a conservative. You fought through the primary system. You were elected governor of Kentucky. I think your advice during these times would be particularly useful.